I spent 40 years as a watchmaker, using those oil-stained hands to support my family and pay off this house. But that night, my son stopped me in the middle of the living room in front of his friends. He glanced at my hands and sneered. "Get out of the way, Dad. Your oil smell is ruining the air. You look more like a handyman than the owner of this house." The whole room burst into laughter. I said nothing, no argument. But what he didn't understand was in that very moment, everything in his life had begun to go off track. "I am grateful you chose to spend this time here. Tell me in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from tonight? You might be surprised how many people around the world are sitting with the same story. Note some elements of this story are fictional, added to serve the telling. Names and settings are not drawn from any specific person or place, but the lesson inside them is. The first thing I noticed when I turned onto Eastmoreland Boulevard that Friday evening was the cars. There were 6 of them parked along the curb in front of my house. A silver Mercedes, 2 late-model BMWs, and a handful of others that probably cost more than I made in a year fixing other people's timepieces. I sat in my old Ford for a moment, with the engine running, looking at those cars the way you look at something that doesn't quite belong in the picture you've been living in for 25 years. I turned off the ignition and sat there a little longer. The maple tree in the front yard had started turning. The edges of the leaves had gone red and gold overnight, the way they always do in early October in Portland, quietly, without asking permission. I'd planted that tree the year Margaret and I moved in. It was barely taller than my knee back then. Now the branches reached past the second-floor windows, and on evenings like this one, the setting sun caught the leaves in a way that made the whole front of the house look like it was on fire. I got out of the car, locked it, and walked to the front door. I could hear the music before I even touched the handle. Something with too much bass and not enough melody, the kind of thing that fills a room without actually saying anything. And underneath it, laughter. The bright performative kind that people do when they're trying to impress each other. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room, my living room with the oak floors I'd refinished myself back in 2011, and the bookshelves Margaret had picked out from an estate sale in Lake Oswego, was full of strangers. 8, maybe 10 of them. Men in fitted blazers with the sleeves pushed up, women in dresses that probably had names I'd never heard of. Somebody had moved the coffee table against the wall to make space. There were wine glasses on every flat surface, including the windowsill, where Margaret used to keep her small clay pots of herbs. The herb pots were gone. I didn't know when that had happened. My son Donovan was standing near the fireplace with a glass of red wine, gesturing at something with the easy confidence of a man who has never once worried about the electric bill. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, and handsome in the way that makes people assume things about a person that aren't necessarily true. He saw me come in, and something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, more like mild inconvenience. He excused himself from his group and crossed the room toward me, not quietly enough, not carefully enough. 2 or 3 of his guests glanced over as he moved. That was the first thing I noticed. He had not thought to be discreet about it. "Dad." His voice came out louder than he intended, carrying just far enough to reach the nearest cluster of his friends. "Hey, you're home early." "I've been at the shop since 8 this morning," I said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he is not listening. Then he looked down at my hands openly without any attempt to make it seem like something else, and his expression shifted into something I had not seen on his face before. Not embarrassment, something closer to impatience. "Look." He said it at full conversational volume, not a whisper. "You've got oil on your jacket. Your hands. The smell follows you when you've been working all day. It's just... He stopped, glanced back at the room, and I watched two of his friends register the exchange. One smiled at something and looked away. Another simply turned her back. "It's a whole thing, Dad. You look more like a repairman than someone who owns a place like this." The room did not go silent. It was worse than that. The conversation continued at the same pitch, the same bright, performative laughter moving through the space, and no one paused or intervened because no one needed to. It had happened quickly and cleanly, the way small humiliations always do when someone has practiced delivering them. "Just stay in the study tonight, okay?" Donovan said, already turning. "I'll come find you when everyone leaves." He was back with his friends before I had moved from the doorway. I stood in the entryway of my own home with my keys still in my hand, 68 years old, wearing a jacket that smelled like the 40 years of work that had paid for every square foot of the floor he was standing on. I thought about saying something. Several things, actually. I had the words. I just didn't use them. I walked down the hallway and into the study. Closed the door behind me. The study was the one room in the house that felt unchanged. The walls were still the same warm cream color Margaret had chosen. The bookshelves still held her paperbacks alongside my engineering manuals and the half-dozen reference books on mechanical horology I'd collected over the years. Her reading chair was still in the corner by the window, angled toward the lamp the way she'd always kept it. On the small desk near the door, her photograph. The one from our trip to the Oregon coast in 2016, 3 years before she got sick. She was laughing at something. Just outside the frame of the picture, her hair pulled back, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. I'd taken that photo without her knowing. I set my keys on the desk beside the frame and sat down in my chair. On the shelf directly across from me, between a copy of Watchmaking by George Daniels and an old atlas Margaret had refused to throw away, was a small brown leather journal. The cover was worn soft at the corners from years of sitting in the same spot. On the front, in Margaret's careful handwriting, were 4 words, "For Walter. When the time comes." She had placed it there herself sometime in the last months before she passed. I had never moved it. I had never opened it. Every morning for 6 years I had looked at it when I came in to read, and every morning I had looked away again. The laughter from the living room pushed through the closed door like water under a threshold. I sat there with my oil-stained hands folded in my lap and looked at Margaret's journal for a long time. The music thumped on. A burst of laughter went up louder than the rest, the kind that fills a house and somehow makes it feel emptier at the same time. I did not get up to make dinner. I did not pick up a book. I did not do any of the small, purposeful things I normally use to fill an evening. I just sat there in the quiet of that room and thought about those 4 words on the cover of the journal. When the time comes, I had spent 6 years telling myself the time had not yet come. Sitting there that night, listening to strangers laugh in my living room while my son's words about the smell of my jacket hung in the air of the hallway. I found myself wondering for the first time, with a kind of cold and unfamiliar clarity, whether I had simply been waiting too long. I didn't open the journal. Not that night. But I looked at it for a very long time before I finally reached over and turned off the lamp. The workshop had its own kind of silence, not the heavy, suffocating kind that had settled over the rest of the house the night before, but something older and more honest, shaped by 40 years of careful work. By 6 in the morning, I was already at the bench, the single overhead lamp casting a warm circle of light across the worktop, while Portland's early October fog pressed soft and gray against the windows. The maple tree in the front yard was invisible from back here. From the workshop, the world was exactly as large as I needed it to be. The sign above the door, a small cedar plank Margaret had carved herself, the letters burned in by hand, read Ashford and Company Timepiece Restoration. She'd made it the first summer after I converted the old garden shed into a proper workspace. She presented it to me on a Saturday morning, wrapped in newspaper tied with kitchen twine. I'd hung it that same afternoon and never moved it. That was the kind of woman she was. I was working on a pocket watch from 1943, a Hamilton military issue piece, the kind that had spent decades in someone's drawer before finding its way to me through an estate sale in Beaverton. The movement was intact, but stiff, the mainspring brittle with age, the jewels clouded. I'd been cleaning it in stages over 3 days, the way you have to with something that old. You can't rush it. Rush it, and you break something that took 80 years to become what it is. My hands trembled slightly as I held the movement under the loupe. They've done that for the last several years, a small, persistent tremor that my doctor says is nothing to worry about, and that I notice constantly anyway. But the tremor has never once made me inaccurate. There's a difference between shaking and being unsteady, and I learned that difference a long time ago. In the corner of the workshop, angled toward the window where the morning light would fall across the pages of whatever she was reading, stood a wooden chair. Ladderback painted white, the seat worn smooth in the center from years of use. Margaret had brought it out here herself one spring afternoon without asking, and simply set it in that corner as though it had always belonged there. She used to sit in it on Saturday mornings while I worked. Reading mostly, though, sometimes she'd just watch. She said there was something settling about the sound of the tools, the small, precise sounds of things being put right. I never fully understood that until she was gone and the chair was empty, and the only sounds in the workshop were the ones I made myself. 6 years. The chair was still there. I'd never moved it either. I heard the knock at the workshop door at 6:22, which meant Ray Kowalski was running a few minutes behind his usual time. My neighbor of 20 years came in without waiting for an answer. He never waited for an answer, and set a ceramic mug on the corner of the workbench where the surface was clear. Ray was 71, a retired carpenter from Milwaukee who had moved in next door 3 months after Margaret and I bought this house. He was the kind of man who showed up when things were wrong without ever needing to be called. He had done that the morning after Margaret passed. He had done it a dozen times since. He set the second mug down for himself and pulled a stool from beside the door. He looked at my face the way he always does, once directly and then away. "Coffee's from the good bag," he said. "The Guatemalan." "Thank you, Ray." He settled onto the stool and wrapped both hands around his mug. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. That was the other thing about Ray. He understood that silence between people who know each other well is not the same thing as emptiness. He was looking through the workshop's small interior window at the display case in my study, where a row of timepieces stood behind glass in felt-lined slots. "Still keeping the replicas in the case?" he asked. "Margaret's policy," I said, without looking up from the movement. "She always said the real ones were too valuable to put on display. Said showing off the good stuff just invited the wrong kind of attention." I set the loupe down and reached for my coffee. She was right about most things. Ray nodded slowly. "She was right about most things," he agreed. I told him about the night before. Not all at once it came out in pieces the way things do when you're still sorting them yourself. The cars parked out front. The strangers in the living room. Donovan's voice in the hallway, low and deliberate, the words about the smell. The walk down the hall to the study. The closed door. Ray listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. When I finished, he sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret would have had them out the front door by the end of the first week." "I know," I said. He put his mug down on the workbench carefully away from my tools. "How long are you going to let this go on, Walt?" I looked at the pocket watch on the bench in front of me. The movement sat there half-assembled, waiting. You could see every component laid out in order, each one small, each one necessary, each one exactly where it needed to be to make the whole thing work. I didn't answer Ray's question. I didn't have an answer yet, or at least not one I was ready to say out loud. He left around 7:15 the way he always does on Saturday mornings. I watched him cross the backyard through the workshop window and disappear through the gate in the fence. I picked up my tools and went back to the watch. And then, from somewhere beyond the back door of the house, I heard my son's voice. He was on the back porch, talking on his phone. I couldn't make out the words from where I sat, just the tone of it. Low, deliberate, assured. The same voice he used in the living room with his friends the night before. Not the voice he used with me. I set my tools down on the bench. I sat very still and listened to the shape of that conversation, the pauses, the cadence, the way his voice dropped at certain moments and rose at others. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I had spent 40 years learning how to read the behavior of small, precise mechanisms, and something in the rhythm of that voice told me the watch on my bench was not the only thing in need of attention. I needed a smaller screwdriver. That was the only reason I got up from the bench that morning. The number 0 blade I'd been using on the Hamilton movement was leaving faint marks on the screw heads, and the set I kept in the house was more complete than the one out in the workshop. A small thing, an ordinary errand, the kind of thing that happens 100 times a week without consequence. I covered the pocket watch with a clean cloth the way you do when you leave a piece mid-restoration and pushed back from the bench. Before I went inside, I paused at the workshop door and looked back at the wall above the tool cabinet. There was a framed photograph up there, 8 by 10, a little faded at the edges, now taken in the spring of 2003 at Portland Technical College. A mechanical engineering elective I'd taught for 2 semesters, back when the college still ran the continuing education program. 11 students arranged in 2 rows, squinting into the late afternoon sun. Me in the middle, younger by more than 20 years, holding a caliper somebody had handed me right before the shutter clicked. I don't know why I looked at it that morning. I hadn't looked at it in months, but something made me stop for a moment and take it in all those faces I mostly couldn't name anymore, all that particular quality of light that only exists in spring in the Pacific Northwest. Then I turned and went inside. The back hallway of the house runs from the kitchen toward the rear entrance past the utility room and the coat closet ending at the door that connects to the covered porch. The door was pulled almost shut, but not latched the way it often was when someone had gone through it in a hurry. I could hear the porch from the moment I stepped into the hallway. I could hear Donovan's voice. He wasn't speaking quietly. He had no reason to. He didn't know the back door was open, didn't know I'd come inside, didn't know anything, except that he was standing on the porch of a house he believed would eventually be his. His voice had that particular ease to it, the loose, unhurried confidence of a man who is not being watched. I stopped walking. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I stopped because my feet stopped the way they sometimes do, before the rest of you has processed what your ears have already understood. The old man's not going anywhere fast, Donovan was saying. But when he does 4 bedrooms Eastmoreland location, we're talking serious rental income. Easy 3 units if you reconfigure the upstairs. The workshop out back alone could go as a studio. A pause. Then, I just need him out of the way a little longer. The place is basically mine already. It's just a matter of timing. I stood in the back hallway of my house for what felt like a long time. The utility room was to my left. The coat closet was to my right. A strip of pale October sunlight lay across the linoleum floor where the back door had let it in. I looked at that strip of light, and I thought about the word he'd used. Timing. As though I were a variable in a schedule. As though 68 years of living had been reduced to an inconvenient gap between where he was and where he intended to be. I turned around and walked back to the workshop without the screwdriver. I sat down at the bench and put both hands flat on the worktop. The tremor was there the way it always is. I looked at my hands for a moment. The oil stains in the creases, the calluses along the right index finger from years of holding fine tools. the thin scar on my left palm from a slip with a case knife back in 1987. 40 years of work in a pair of hands that my son found embarrassing enough to hide from his friends. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the workbench and took out the manila folder I kept there. Inside was a single document, the deed to the house at 1847 Eastmoreland Boulevard. I had pulled it out a handful of times over the years, for various practical reasons, and put it back without ceremony. I spread it open on the bench now and read the name printed across the top line. Walter James Ashford. One name, only one. I had arranged it that way years ago, after Margaret mentioned a neighbor's estate dispute, a wife left unprotected, because the deed had carried two names, and the wrong one outlived the right one. I had gone to the title office the following week and said nothing to anyone about it. Just mine. I sat there and let that fact settle. And then, without quite deciding to, I found myself remembering something from 3 weeks earlier. Lydia had come by on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to have lunch, though she'd eaten half a sandwich and spent most of the visit standing in my study. She'd been looking at the display case where I keep the replica pieces, the careful reconstructions and period-accurate reproductions I've built or acquired over the years for reference and study. She'd been asking about the Patek Philippe in the center slot. Not admiring it. Asking about it. Year of manufacture. Movement caliber. Current market value for an authentic example in comparable condition. The questions of someone taking inventory. 3 days after that visit, on a Wednesday morning before I opened the shop, I had driven to the First National branch on Southeast Hawthorne and placed the contents of my workshop safe into a deposit box. The real pieces, the authenticated ones, the ones that actually mattered, all of it transferred quietly, without announcement, without explanation, to anyone. I was a watchmaker. I knew how to protect the things worth protecting. I folded the deed and put it back in the drawer. I sat there for a long time with my hands flat on the worktop, listening to the clocks. At some point I reached for my phone. There was a number I had saved 3 years ago and never used. A woman who had handed me her card at a neighborhood meeting without any pressure, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew her value and was willing to wait. I had told myself the time wasn't right. Sitting there that night, I understood that I had simply been waiting for a reason that felt sufficient. I had one now. I put the phone down without dialing. Not yet. But the decision had been made, and made decisions have a different weight than undecided ones. I could feel it settling. The last set of headlights swept across the workshop window at 9:23. I watched the beam travel along the far wall, across the pegboard of tools, across the shelf of movements waiting for repair, and then it was gone. The sound of the engine faded down Southeast Knapp, and then there was nothing left but the clocks. Dozens of them. Wall clocks, mantel clocks, a bracket clock in the corner that hadn't found its owner yet. All of them running. All of them ticking in that layered, overlapping rhythm that most people find unsettling when they first step into this room. I had stopped hearing it as noise a long time ago. Margaret used to say I had gone deaf to silence. That wasn't quite right. I had just learned that silence in here had a shape to it. The ticking was the silence. The sound of time moving in an orderly way, each gear doing what it was made to do, nothing more and nothing less. I sat at the workbench with my hands flat on the surface and let that shape settle around me. I thought about this morning, about Ray's question, "How long are you going to let this go on, Walt?" and the way I hadn't answered it. About what I had heard from the back porch 3 hours later. Donovan's voice, low and careful, talking to someone about 4 bedrooms in Eastmoreland, about serious rental income, about needing the old man not to block anything. One more time, as if there had been previous times, as if my silence on every occasion before this one had been permission. I thought about Lydia 3 weeks ago, standing in the doorway of this very room, asking me about the Patek Philippe. Not casually, specifically. The year of manufacture, the caliber number, whether I had documentation of provenance. The kind of questions an appraiser asks. The kind of questions a daughter does not ask her father about a watch he has owned for 30 years, unless she has already decided what she intends to do with it. And I thought about the folder in the side drawer, the one with my own handwriting on the tab. One name on the deed, just mine. The Hamilton movement I had planned to work on tonight sat untouched in its holder. I looked at it for a moment, then looked at the wall. The 2003 photograph was still up there the way it had been for 22 years. A group of students from the Portland Technical College repair workshop standing in front of the school's lab. I was younger in it. Same hands, different face. Holding a movement up toward the camera with the particular pride of a man who had not yet understood how much he still had to learn. There was a serious-looking young man standing just to my left, the kind of student who stayed late and asked the right questions. I had not thought about him in years. Below the photograph, the glass display case held 6 replica movements on felt stands. I had always kept replicas for study. Margaret had tolerated this habit with the gentle skepticism she applied to most of my workshop logic. Why keep something fake? Because you learn the same mechanics, I had told her without risking the original. She had accepted this the way she accepted most of my answers, not entirely convinced, but willing to let it stand. The real ones were somewhere else now. 3 weeks ago, the same week Lydia had asked her careful questions, I had driven to First National on a Tuesday morning and rented a safe deposit box. I had put the collection inside. I had driven home. I had not said a word about it to anyone because it had not been a dramatic decision. It had simply been the next logical thing to do, the way you move a fragile piece off a cluttered bench before you know exactly what is about to fall. Now I reached into the side drawer and found my phone. I had saved Eleanor Voss's number 3 years ago at a neighborhood association meeting on Knapp Street, one of those October evenings where everyone in Eastmoreland sits in folding chairs in the community room and talks about street lighting and property values. She had passed her card across the row to me without me asking for it. In case you ever need anything, she had said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has built a career on being available at the right moment. Eleanor Voss Property Group, licensed real estate broker, State of Oregon. I had put the number in my phone that same night and never looked at it again. Until now. It rang twice. "This is Eleanor." Her voice was steady, professional, shaped by years of answering calls from people who were not sure how to say what they needed. "My name is Walter Ashford," I said. "I have a home in Eastmoreland. 4 bedrooms, 2 floors. It's paid off completely. No liens, no disputes." I paused, keeping my voice even. If someone wanted to sell fairly quickly, how fast could that realistically happen in this market? A brief silence. Not hesitation. The silence of someone thinking accurately before they speak. "Mr. Ashford, a well-maintained Eastmoreland property with clean title and motivated seller." She let the sentence breathe for a moment. "In this Portland market, you could have an offer inside a week, sometimes faster if the pricing is right." "What would you need from me?" "Just a walkthrough," she said, "and an honest conversation." "Monday morning," I said. "Early, 6:30 if that works for you." A small pause, not reluctance, just the mild surprise of someone unaccustomed to being asked for a 6:30 appointment on a weekend call. "I can do that," she said. "I'll see you Monday, Mr. Ashford." I set the phone down on the workbench beside the Hamilton movement. For a moment, I just sat there, not moving, listening to the clocks. I looked at Margaret's white ladder-back chair in the corner, the cushions still holding the shape of someone who was no longer there. I looked at the 2003 photograph. I looked at the display case with its 6 replicas behind glass. Each one a perfect copy of something real, something kept elsewhere now for safekeeping. Then I looked at the shelf on the far wall. The shelf was bare. A rectangle of slightly lighter paint, where the wooden collection box had stood for 11 years, marked the space like a sentence that had already been finished. 3 weeks ago, I had carried that box out to my car on a Tuesday morning, and no one had noticed, and no one had asked, and no one had any idea it was gone. They would find out soon enough. I reached over and turned off the bench lamp. The workshop went dark, except for the faint glow of the clock faces. All of them still running. All of them still keeping time, 1 gear, 1 second, 1 careful turn at a time. I sat in the dark for a little while longer. Then I got up and went inside. The fog came in thick off the Willamette overnight, the way it always does in October. And by 6 in the morning, it had settled over Eastmoreland like something permanent. From the kitchen window, the maple in the backyard was just a shape red and blurred at the edges, the way things look when the world hasn't fully decided to be visible yet. I had been up since 5. The coffee was already made, 2 cups set out on the counter the way Margaret used to when she was expecting company she respected. I wasn't sure why I had done that. Habit, maybe. Or something closer to wanting this morning to begin the right way, with the kind of small, deliberate order that keeps a man steady when he knows what's coming. Eleanor Voss pulled up at 6:29. She drove a dark green Subaru Practical, unassuming, the kind of car that belongs in Portland, the way rain belongs in Portland. She came up the front walk with a leather portfolio under one arm and a coffee of her own in the other hand, wearing a gray blazer over dark slacks, her silver hair pulled back without fuss. She was the kind of woman who had walked through 1,000 houses in her career and had learned how to enter each one without imposing herself on it. "Mr. Ashford," she said, and shook my hand at the door. Firm grip, brief. Professional in the way that people are professional when they don't need to perform it. "Come in," I said. "Coffee's on the counter." She set her portfolio on the kitchen table and took a slow look around. Not the hurried assessment of someone working through a checklist, but the careful, unhurried attention of someone who knows that a house will tell you what it needs to tell you, if you give it a moment. She looked at the ceiling height, the quality of the morning light coming through the windows, the wear pattern on the hardwood floors. I drank my coffee and let her look. We moved through the house room by room. She asked me practical questions, the age of the roof, the furnace, whether the windows had been updated. I answered them. She made notes in her portfolio without commenting on anything she saw, which I appreciated. Most people feel the need to fill silence with observations. Eleanor seemed to understand that silence in a house is information. The guest bedroom, the hallway with its built-in bookshelves, the master bedroom where I had slept on my side of the bed for 6 years now, without ever moving to the center. She noted the closet space and said nothing else. Then we went out through the side door to the workshop. She stepped inside and stopped. I watched her look at the pegboard of tools, the clock faces on the wall, the bracket clock in the corner, the bench with its careful arrangement of instruments, the cedar sign above the door. Margaret's work, still there the way it had always been. "This is remarkable," Eleanor said. "Yeah, my wife designed it," I said. "The layout, the lighting, all of it." Eleanor looked at Margaret's white ladder-back chair in the corner, just a glance, not prolonged, and then looked back at the room. "She had good instincts," she said. "Yes," I said. "She did." We went back inside to the kitchen. Eleanor set her portfolio on the table, opened it, and looked at me directly. "Is there anyone else living in the home, Mr. Ashford?" "My adult children," I said. "They've been staying here." "Do they know about this?" "Not yet." She nodded once, the nod of a woman who had heard variations of this answer before and had learned not to attach judgment to it. "All right," she said. "Then let me ask you something more important." She set her pen down on the portfolio. "What do you want most from this sale?" I looked past her at the kitchen window. Outside, the fog was beginning to thin at the edges. The maple was coming back into focus, leaf by leaf. "Clean," I said. "No complications, no delays. No drawn-out negotiation that gives anyone time to find a reason to slow things down. Then we price it right from the start, she said. No games, no anchoring high and hoping. We come in at market, generate real interest, and move. That's what I want. She picked up her pen again and made a note. That was when we heard footsteps on the stairs. Lydia came into the kitchen first. She had her hair down, still wearing the oversized sweatshirt she slept in, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw Eleanor, the tablet on the table, the portfolio. The way two people stand when they are in the middle of a transaction. The color went out of her face in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. 30 seconds later, Donovan appeared behind her. He was unshaven, his hair angled from sleep, and he took in the scene with the flat, slow look of someone whose mind is catching up to what his eyes are already reading. He heard the word realtor. I don't know if Eleanor said it or if Lydia did, and he stopped at the bottom step like he'd walked into a wall. What is she doing here? His voice was rough at the edges and aimed at me, not at her. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, set the pot back on the burner, turned around. She's here to help me sell the house, I said. You can't sell this house. The words came out fast, louder than he intended. Dad, you cannot sell this house. I set my cup down on the counter, slowly. The way you set a fragile movement down when you are finished with it and have nothing left to prove about how steady your hands are. I looked at my son. Watch me, I said. Behind him, Lydia hadn't moved. She hadn't said a word. She was standing with her arms crossed, her eyes moving slowly around the kitchen, across the counters, the window, the hallway, in a way that had nothing to do with surprise or anger. It was the same way she had looked at the workshop 3 weeks ago when she asked me about the Patek Philippe. Methodical, quiet, like someone taking inventory of a place they've already decided belongs to them. She didn't know I was watching her do it. She never did. By 5 o'clock, the fog had burned off completely, the way October fog in Portland always does, not gradually, but all at once, as if the day had finally made up its mind. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, amber and unhurried, laying itself across the counter in a long stripe that reached the far edge of the sink. I had been at the shop since 10. A woman on Belmont had brought in a Seth Thomas mantel clock with a broken mainspring, straightforward work, the kind that steadies the hands and quiets the mind. I had finished it by 2, returned it by 4, and driven home through the residential streets of Eastmoreland with the windows cracked, breathing in the smell of fallen leaves and someone's wood fire 2 blocks over. The house was quiet when I came in. Eleanor had been gone since 8 in the morning. Whatever had happened at breakfast, Donovan's voice going rough at the edges, Lydia standing silent in the doorway, had apparently settled back into the uneasy stillness that passed for normal around here. I could hear Donovan's voice upstairs, low and indistinct, another phone call. Lydia's door was closed. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes over a house in the late afternoon that has nothing to do with whether anyone is home. It's the quiet of a day winding down, of light, changing of the ordinary machinery of a household running at half speed. I had always liked this hour. Margaret had called it the amber hour, not for the light, but for the way time seemed to move through it more slowly, like something suspended. The kettle hadn't come to a boil yet when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. A number I didn't recognize, Portland area code 503 local. I answered it the way I answer all calls from numbers I don't know, with a kind of neutral readiness, prepared for it to be nothing important. Mr. Ashford. The voice on the other end was measured, careful. A man in his early 40s, I would have guessed the voice of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was now trying to deliver it without letting the rehearsal show. My name is Greg Tambor. I'm a private investor based here in Portland. A brief pause. I invested in a startup called Ashford Tech Ventures approximately 18 months ago. $100,000 commitment disbursed in 2 tranches. Another pause shorter. I was given to understand that you were a co-signatory on the underlying loan guarantee. $47,000. I've been trying to reach you for several months. I set the kettle down on the counter without turning off the burner. I'm sorry, I said. A co-signatory on what exactly? The silence on his end lasted long enough that I could hear him deciding something. Mr. Ashford, he said carefully. There are documents on file with our investment group that carry your signature, your full name, Walter J. Ashford. They were presented to us by your son as evidence of family backing for the venture. The documents were part of the original loan guarantee package. I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. Above me, Donovan's voice continued, easy, unhurried, the particular rhythm of a man who believes he is ahead of everything. The kettle began to steam quietly on the burner behind me. Mr. Tambor, I said, I need you to send me those documents, everything you have, right now if possible. I can do that, he said. There was something in his voice that I recognized, not hostility, but the exhausted relief of a man who has been trying to get to this moment for a long time. I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Ashford. I'm not calling to make threats. I'm calling because I think we may both have a problem, and I'd rather deal with it honestly. He paused once more. I don't believe you knew about this. Send the documents, I said. Please. He did. I watched the email arrive in real time, the small notification at the top of my screen, the sender name G. Tambor, the subject line reading Ashford Tech Ventures Guarantee Documentation. I opened it at the kitchen table. There were 4 attachments. I opened the largest one first. A 12-page investment agreement, single-spaced, the kind of document that takes a lawyer an hour to read properly, and a layman 3. I scrolled past the cover page, past the terms, past the disbursement schedule, until I reached the signature page at the back. Walter J. Ashford, written in blue ink, dated 14 months ago. I looked at that signature for a long time. 40 years of signing my name on work orders, warranty certificates, repair receipts. 40 years of the same pen, moving in the same way across paper. The W looping slightly right. The A in Ashford always a degree taller than it needed to be, a habit from the first penmanship class I had ever taken in a schoolroom in Eastern Oregon when I was 7 years old. I knew my own signature the way I knew the sound of a movement running true. I had looked at it 10,000 times. This one was close. It was not mine. I set the phone face down on the table. I sat still for a moment, with my hands flat on the surface the way I had sat at the workbench on Saturday night. Not because I was calm, but because stillness is what I reach for when everything else wants to move too fast. Then I picked the phone back up and called Richard Holloway. Richard had been my attorney for 11 years, a quiet, methodical man who wore the same style of tortoiseshell glasses he'd worn the first day I met him, and who had never once in those 11 years given me advice I regretted taking. He answered on the second ring. I told him everything. The call from Greg Tambor, the documents, the signature on page 12. When I finished, Richard was quiet for 3 full seconds. I counted them. Walter, he said, and the way he said my name told me he had already begun thinking through the implications. If this is what I think it is, we need to move before the property sale closes. Signature forgery in Oregon carries serious consequences. Another pause. And Walter, if Donovan did this once, there may be other documents we haven't seen yet. Funny other documents we haven't seen yet. I sat in the amber light of the kitchen, the kettle long since boiled and gone cold, and let that sentence settle into me the way a diagnosis settles, not all at once, but layer by layer, each layer revealing something new about the shape of the thing you are dealing with. 30 years of being a father. And I had never once been afraid of my own son before tonight. Portland gives you maybe a dozen mornings like this one each October, the kind where the fog decides not to show up, where the sky comes in clear and pale blue from the first hour, and the light falls through the trees at an angle that makes the whole neighborhood look like it was arranged by someone who cared about the composition. The maple in the backyard had gone deeper red overnight. I stood at the kitchen window with my first cup of coffee and watched the light move across it, and I thought about almost nothing at all. That was the only quiet I was going to get today. The photographer arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. His name was Kyle, mid-20s, methodical, in the way that young professionals are when they are still earning the right to be confident. He drove a white hatchback and carried his equipment in 2 cases, which he set down on the porch and opened with the focused efficiency of someone who does the same setup in a different house every morning. Wide-angle lens, portable light panel, a carbon fiber tripod that he assembled without looking at his hands. "I'll start with the main rooms and work back," he said. "Natural light first, then I'll supplement. It usually takes about 2 hours. Take whatever time you need," I said and stepped out of his way. That was the thing about having a professional come into your home to document it. You had to learn to stop being the one in charge of the space. Kyle moved through the kitchen, the living room, the dining area with its view of the backyard, and I followed at a distance, watching him see my house the way a stranger sees it. The light on the hardwood floors, the proportions of the front room, the way the back windows framed the maple tree, as if the yard had been designed for exactly this angle. He didn't say much, just moved and shot each shutter click landing in the quiet of the house, like something being recorded that could not be taken back. Donovan appeared at the top of the stairs at 8:45. He stood there with his arms crossed, watching Kyle move through the living room below, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has decided something is not real and is waiting for reality to agree with him. "You're really doing this, yeah," he said. Not a question. The flat statement of someone who has run out of disbelief. I was standing near the kitchen doorway. I looked up at him, then at Kyle, who had moved on to the dining room and was adjusting the tripod without any apparent awareness that the two of us existed. "The kitchen window gets good light in the morning," I said to Kyle. "You might want the one facing the garden." Donovan stood at the top of the stairs for another 30 seconds, then turned and went back to his room. His door didn't slam. It closed quietly, which was somehow worse. Lydia came down 20 minutes later, dressed composed, carrying her coffee in both hands, the way she always did when she was thinking. She followed Kyle up the stairs with a casualness that I recognized as anything but casual, drifting room to room, slightly behind him, pausing in doorways, taking in the angles he was shooting. When they reached my office, she stopped in front of the glass display case and stood there looking at the replica movements on their felt stands with the same careful attention she had given them 3 weeks ago. I watched her from the hallway outside the room. She didn't know I was there. She reached out once, just her fingertips resting briefly against the glass, and then withdrew her hand and followed Kyle to the next room without a word. I stayed where I was for a moment after they'd gone. Then I went back downstairs. Kyle saved the workshop for last. He stood in the doorway before he came inside, the way Eleanor had that same pause that the room seemed to require from anyone seeing it for the first time. The pegboard of tools, the bracket clock in the corner, the bench with its ordered arrangement of instruments that had not moved from their positions in 40 years, except to be used and returned. Margaret's cedar sign above the door unchanged. "This is the most interesting room in the house," Kyle said. He was already adjusting his lens. "It was my wife's favorite too," I said. He nodded, not looking up from his viewfinder, and I appreciated that he didn't ask about her. Eleanor arrived at 9:30 with a man I hadn't seen before. She introduced him to me briefly, a potential buyer doing a preliminary walkthrough, and he shook my hand with the polite efficiency of someone moving through an obligation. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, well-built, a gray canvas jacket over dark jeans. He moved through the main rooms, quietly asking few questions the way people do when they are seeing a house for the second or third time in their minds before they've ever set foot in it. He said almost nothing until he reached the workshop. He stopped at the door. Not the pause of someone processing an unfamiliar room, something else. His eyes went directly to the cedar sign above the doorframe. Ashford and Company Timepiece Restoration. He stood there and read it twice, and then his gaze dropped to the bench, to the tools, to the clock faces on the wall, moving across the room with a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with real estate. I was standing 10 feet behind him. I watched him stand there. Whatever he was seeing, it wasn't the square footage. He came back to himself after a moment, straightened slightly, and moved on without saying anything. Eleanor guided him toward the back garden, and I stayed where I was watching the space where he had been standing. Kyle packed his equipment and was gone by 10:15. Donovan found me in the kitchen an hour later. He leaned against the counter with his arms still crossed, the same posture he'd held all morning, and said, "Once it goes up online, there's no going back, Dad." I looked at him. I thought about a 12-page document with a signature on page 12 that was almost mine, but wasn't. I thought about Richard Holloway saying other documents we haven't seen yet, in a voice that meant he was already thinking several steps ahead of the conversation. "I know," I said. He waited for more. There wasn't any. The quiet that followed was the kind that fills a room when one person has finished, and the other one hasn't started yet, and both of them know it. That evening, Eleanor's text came through while I was in the workshop. "Photos are excellent, Walter. Listing goes live at 7 a.m. tomorrow. 2 showing requests already, one specifically asked to see the clock workshop." I read it twice, set the phone down on the bench, picked it up and read it again. Someone had asked specifically about the workshop. I didn't know why that stopped me the way it did, just a small hesitation, like a gear catching for half a second before it finds its seat. Nothing I could explain. Just the feeling that something was moving toward this house that I hadn't planned for and couldn't quite see yet. After Kyle left the house, settled back into the particular quiet that follows strangers, that sense of the walls reasserting themselves, reclaiming their own air. I had eaten dinner alone in the kitchen, listening to the TV in the living room below, where Donovan had parked himself after 5 o'clock. A laugh track drifted up through the floor at irregular intervals, punctuating the silence, the way a clock with a faulty escapement ticks, present but unsteady, reminding you that something is slightly wrong with the mechanism. I was in my study by 7:30. The desk lamp was on. The room was otherwise dark. I had spent 40 years learning how damage works. A watchmaker's whole practice is the study of failure, what breaks, why it breaks, and whether it was broken by time or by intention. Wear looks different from sabotage. Wear is gradual, consistent, distributed evenly across the parts that carry the most load. Sabotage leaves marks in the wrong places. Pressure applied from an angle the mechanism was never designed to accommodate. You learn to see the difference after a while. You learn to look for it even when you're not expecting to find it. Richard Holloway called at 8 o'clock. "I've gone through everything Greg Tambor sent," he said. No preamble, no small talk. Richard had never been a man who believed that softening information changed its nature. I've compared the signature on the guarantee documents against your authenticated samples on file from the 2019 deed transfer and the 2021 estate planning documents. A pause, the pause of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is deciding how directly to deliver it. Walter, it's a forgery, a competent one. Someone spent real time on it. But the angle of pressure on the J is wrong. Your J leans into the next letter. It's a connecting stroke part of how you link to the A. This one stands alone, and the loop on your capital A in Ashford yours opens wider at the base. This one closes too tight. Whoever practiced this got the general shape right, but missed the weight distribution. Another pause. Donovan has seen your signature his entire life. He got closer than most people would. He just didn't get close enough. I said nothing. The company dissolved after 6 months of operation. Richard continued. Ashford Tech Ventures. It was registered in Oregon in January of 2024, dissolved in July of 2024. The $47,000 was part of a larger guarantee package presented to 4 small investors. None of them have recovered a cent, and none of them were ever told that the co-signatory had no knowledge of the arrangement and had not, in fact, signed anything. Below me, through the floor, the laugh track fired again. Donovan laughed along with it. That easy, unguarded laugh of a man watching television on a Monday evening with no particular weight on his shoulders. What do I need to do? I said. I'm filing an affidavit on your behalf with the county recorder's office, Richard said. A formal declaration that the signature is not yours and that you had no knowledge of the loan guarantee. This needs to be on record before the property sale closes. A title search during escrow could surface the investor claims if any of them have filed judgment liens. We need to get ahead of it. He stopped. I'd advise against confronting Donovan directly before I've filed. If he moves assets or disputes the record first, it complicates things. Do what you need to do, I said. So don't warn him. Understood. I'll have the affidavit drafted by Thursday morning. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a while with just the desk lamp and the sound of the television below. I thought about the first time Donovan had borrowed money from me. He had been 23, a restaurant venture with a friend, a place on Division Street that lasted 14 months before the friend bought him out at a loss. I had given him $800 and never mentioned it again, because that was what you did. You gave and you didn't keep accounts. That was the contract of being a father, or at least the version of it I had believed in. I opened the side drawer of the desk. The envelope was there, white letter-sized, unsealed. I had started it the previous night after Richard's first call, in the small hours when sleep had stopped being a reasonable expectation. Inside was a single sheet of paper in my own handwriting, a list. 7 years of entries, each one dated, each one with a dollar amount and a brief description. March 2018, Division Street lease deposit covered without request, $1,200. November 2018, auto insurance lapse paid directly to avoid cancellation, $840. June 2019, credit card balance transferred without disclosure, $3,100. And so it continued line by line, year by year, the small, quiet payments that a father makes when he has decided that keeping the peace is worth more than keeping the record. $23,400 over 7 years in amounts small enough that each one felt manageable at the time. In a pattern I had never written down before, because writing it down would have required me to see it for what it was. I picked up the pen. At the bottom of the list, below the last entry, I added 2 new lines. October 2025. Ashford Tech Ventures loan guarantee, forged signature $47,000. See attached documentation. I set the pen down. I read the list from the beginning to the end. Then I folded the sheet, placed it back in the envelope, along with a copy of the documents Greg Tambor had sent, and set it on the desk. I pressed the flap down, but did not seal it. A sealed envelope is a statement. This was not a statement yet. It was a record, and records are kept open until the moment they are needed. I didn't write a name on the outside. He would know. I put the envelope back in the drawer and closed it. Not tonight. Not as a weapon, not as a confrontation, just a record. The kind of record that a careful man keeps, so that when the moment comes, the numbers speak for themselves, and no one can argue with the arithmetic. I turned off the desk lamp and sat for a moment in the dark. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked once and went quiet. My phone rang at 7 the next morning while I was standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee. Eleanor. "Walter, we're live," she said. 3 showing requests in the first hour. The photos are doing exactly what good photos are supposed to do. She paused, and in that pause I recognized the particular quality of a professional who has something specific to say and is choosing how to say it. One of the names on the request list, I thought you should hear it directly. It might mean something to you. "Go ahead," I said. "Derek Sullivan." I stood at the kitchen counter with my coffee cooling in my hand. The name sat in the air between us for a moment. Familiar in the way that things are familiar when you knew them well a long time ago, and have not thought about them since. I reached for it. I knew that name. I was certain that I knew it. But I couldn't yet place where. Eleanor had warned me that the first showing would feel different from the photography session. Kyle had been a professional, doing a job his presence in the house had the neutral quality of a repairman or an inspector, someone with a specific task, and no emotional investment in the outcome. Buyers were different. Buyers walked through your rooms and tried to imagine their lives inside them. And there was something about that, the way a stranger's imagination moved through your walls, that made the house feel briefly like it belonged to no one. The couple arrived at 10 o'clock. Young late 30s, I guessed a husband and wife in matching rain jackets, who had clearly driven over from the west side. Eleanor met them at the door, with the practiced warmth of someone who has conducted 1,000 first impressions, and I stepped back toward the staircase and let her work. That was what I had learned the one time I had asked her how she preferred to run showings, stay visible but not present, Walter. Let the house speak. So I went upstairs. The hallway on the second floor runs the length of the house, 4 doors off it, 2 on each side with a small window at the far end that looks out over the backyard. I stood near that window with my hands in my pockets, listening to Eleanor's voice below moving from room to room. The soft commentary of a woman describing a house to people who were still deciding whether they could see themselves in it. Outside the backyard, Maple was catching the morning light at an angle that turned the red leaves almost copper. October in Portland, on the rare days it chose to be generous. I heard Lydia's door open. She came out quietly, not the rushed, oblivious movement of someone on their way to the bathroom, but the deliberate, unhurried step of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and has decided that moment has arrived. She was dressed. Her hair was done. She carried nothing in her hands. She walked to the end of the hallway and turned into my study without pausing at the door. I was standing in the shadow past the window around the corner, where the hallway bends slightly before the staircase. She had not looked back. She did not know I was there. I waited. Below, Eleanor's voice drifted up something about the natural light in the kitchen, the quality of the hardwood. The husband said something I couldn't make out. The wife laughed at something Eleanor said. All of it ordinary and distant, the sounds of a transaction proceeding normally 1 floor beneath something that was not normal at all. I moved to the study doorway. Lydia was at the display case. She had the glass door open, both panels the way you open it, when you intend to reach inside rather than just look. Her back was to me. I watched her hands move across the felt-covered shelf, bypassing the three smaller movements on the left, going directly to the piece on the far right. The Patek Philippe, the 1940s gentleman's dress watch in the yellow gold case, the one she had asked me about 3 weeks ago with such careful, specific attention. She lifted it out, turned it over in her palm with the practiced ease of someone who has handled watches before, or who has spent enough time researching the specific object to know exactly how to hold it. She brought it closer to the window light, and then she stopped. I watched the stillness come over her. Not the stillness of someone admiring something, but the stillness of someone whose understanding has just shifted. She turned the watch over again, slower this time. Tilted it toward the light at a different angle. Her thumb moved across the case back, feeling for something. She found the serial number and read it. I could see her lips move slightly, and then she read it again. I stepped into the doorway. "The real ones have been at First National for 3 weeks," I said. "Safe deposit box." My voice was level. The same tone I use when I'm explaining a repair to a customer, not unkind, not accusatory, just accurate. The kind of voice that doesn't require a response because the information it carries is sufficient by itself. Lydia turned around. We looked at each other across the width of the room. The morning light came through the study window between us, falling on the open display case, on the replica watch still in her hand, on the slight parting of her lips that was the beginning of a sentence she did not complete. There was nothing to say. I had known that before I stepped into the doorway. Whatever she might have offered, surprise, denial, some version of "I was just looking," would have required me to engage with it, and I had no interest in that conversation. The facts were in her hand. The serial number told the story without either of us needing to narrate it. After a moment, Lydia looked down at the watch. She placed it back on the felt shelf, carefully, more carefully than she had picked it up, with a kind of deliberate precision that seemed in its way like the only acknowledgement she was capable of making. She closed the glass panels. She smoothed the front of her shirt with both hands, a gesture that had nothing to do with her shirt, and then she walked to the doorway. I stepped aside. She went past me without speaking and without looking at me, and I heard her door close at the far end of the hallway, not a slam, just the soft, definitive click of a latch finding its seat. I stood in the study doorway for a moment. Through the window, the copper maple moved slightly in a wind I couldn't hear. She had looked small walking away. I had not wanted to notice that. But a man who has spent his life looking at the precise truth of small things does not get to choose what he sees. I went downstairs. Eleanor was in the living room with a second couple now. The young pair in rain jackets had apparently finished and left while I was upstairs. This couple was older, quieter, moving through the room with the measured attention of people who had looked at enough houses to know what they were actually looking for. Eleanor caught my eye briefly and gave the small, composed nod that I had already learned. Meant things are going well, stay out of the way. I stayed near the base of the stairs. The man was standing at the far wall, the one where Margaret had hung the family photographs in the arrangement she had spent an entire Saturday morning getting right, a cluster of frames in different sizes, the whole span of a life organized by what she had decided was worth keeping visible. He was looking at one of them in particular. Not browsing, looking. The way you look at something you have seen before. The first couple had a daughter maybe 4 years old, small enough to be carried on a hip, but old enough to want to walk on her own. She came in holding her mother's hand and immediately let go of it the way small children do when a new space presents itself as something worth investigating. I watched her cross the living room floor with that particular 4-year-old purposefulness, heading toward nothing specific and everything at once. Eleanor steered the parents through the kitchen, while the girl explored the baseboards. I stayed near the hallway and let them work through the space at their own pace. The mother stopped at the kitchen window, the one that looks out over the backyard, over the maple, over the garden bed Margaret had put in along the south fence, over the workshop with its cedar sign just visible from that angle on a clear day. She stood there with her hands resting lightly on the counter's edge and looked out at it, and I understood exactly what she was seeing. Not the square footage, not the market comparables. Something else, the particular quality of light through that window at mid-morning, the way the yard looked, contained and quiet, and like a place where a life could happen. Margaret had stood at that window almost every morning for 26 years. I turned away and went back to the hallway. The second showing was at 1 o'clock. He came alone this time. The same man from the day before, mid-40s, the gray canvas jacket, that quality of moving through a space with more attention than the space usually receives. Eleanor met him at the door, and I stayed back watching from the dining room archway as he came in and oriented himself the way he had the previous day, slowly, without hurry, like a man who already knows where he's going and is in no particular rush to arrive. He went through the kitchen, the living room. He looked at the ceiling height, the window proportions, the quality of the floors, the way a person looks at things when they are confirming details already studied rather than encountering them fresh. Then he stopped at the photograph wall. Margaret's arrangement, 20-something frames in different sizes, spanning the full width above the sofa, the whole geography of a life compressed into a stretch of painted drywall. He moved along it slowly, taking in the family portraits, the holiday pictures, the candid shots that she had insisted on keeping, because they were real Walter, not just posed. And then he stopped. The photograph was near the left edge of the grouping, 8 by 10 in a plain black frame. A group of young men and women standing in front of the repair lab at Portland Technical College, dated in Margaret's handwriting on the small card below it. Portland Technical College. Watchmaking program. Spring 2003. I was in the center of the group, younger, holding a movement up toward the camera. On my left stood a serious-looking young man in a dark shirt, early 20s. The posture of someone who had learned to be careful with things. The man in the gray jacket looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he turned around. Our eyes met across the room. His expression was not the expression of a buyer evaluating a property. It was the expression of someone who had found what they came looking for. I held his gaze for a moment, then looked away first, not from discomfort, but because I needed to think. Eleanor appeared at his elbow and said something about the master bedroom, and he followed her without looking back at me. And I stood in the dining room archway with the photograph on the wall behind me, and the name that Eleanor had read me that morning, Derek Sullivan, finally finding its shape. Portland Technical College. Fall semester 2003. A young man who had come in on the first day of the watchmaking module with second-hand clothes and no toolkit. He hadn't said anything about it, just sat at the bench with his hands in his lap until I noticed. I had lent him my spare set for the semester. One condition: return them in the same condition you received them. He had. And then he had graduated and moved on. And I had moved on. And 22 years had passed, the way 22 years do, completely without announcement. Donovan appeared at my shoulder during the lull between the second and third showings. He had been upstairs all morning. I had heard his door open and close twice, heard him on the phone once, the tone different from his usual calls, lower and more deliberate. He came up beside me in the kitchen and leaned against the counter, and I could see he had been thinking about what he was going to say. Dad. He kept his voice even, reasonable, the register of a man who has decided to try a different approach. If you go through with this, if you actually sell this house, you're destroying what's left of this family. You understand that there's nothing left after this. I filled a glass from the tap, turned it in my hands for a moment. This family has been making its own choices for a long time, I said. One choice at a time. Everyone in it. I looked at him. Including you. He started to say something else. I set the glass down and went to let in the third couple. They were pleasant, thorough, unremarkable in the way that most serious buyers are focused on the practical details that had already been decided before they walked in the door. The third showing lasted 40 minutes. By 3:30 it was done. The last car had backed out of the driveway, and Eleanor remained at the kitchen table with her portfolio open and her reading glasses on the end of her nose. I sat down across from her. "2 offers," she said. She set the portfolio so I could see the top sheet. "First one came in this afternoon. They're at asking price, 30-day close clean terms, pre-approved financing." She turned the sheet over. "Second one came in an hour ago. Considerably above asking. The buyer has requested a private meeting with you before finalizing. He said you'd understand why when you heard his name." I already knew the name, but I waited. "Now, Derek Sullivan," Eleanor said. I set my glass down on the table. I looked at the window, the one facing the backyard, the one facing the workshop, the one where you could just see the cedar sign on the workshop door if the angle was right and the light was cooperating. Ashford and Company timepiece restoration. Margaret had carved it herself a Saturday afternoon in October of 2003, the same year that photograph on the wall had been taken. She had been particular about the lettering, had practiced it on cardboard 3 times before she touched the cedar. "It has to last, Walter," she had said. "Put your name on something properly, or don't put it on at all." 22 years. The sign had weathered through Portland's wet seasons and its rare bright ones, and the paint had worn to bare wood at the edges, and someone had seen it in a listing photograph and known immediately, without having to think about it, exactly whose workshop it was and what it meant. Eleanor was watching me with the patient attention of a woman who has learned to read rooms. "He recognized the sign," she said. "He told me he saw Ashford and Company in the listing photos and knew immediately. He said he'd been looking for a way to say thank you for 22 years. I looked at the window for a long time. I had spent a long time believing that what you gave away was simply gone, that generosity was a kind of controlled loss, something you made peace with and moved on from. It had seemed like the honest way to think about it, the unsentimental way. I was not sure I believed that anymore. Before I reveal what was inside that envelope and what happened when Donovan finally read it, comment the number 7 below. 7 years. 1 night. 1 piece of paper. A reminder, parts of this story include fictional elements added for the telling. The lesson inside them is not fictional. Stay if you want to see how this ends. By 9 o'clock, the house had gone quiet, in the way it only goes quiet after a long day. Not the ordinary quiet of an evening winding down, but the specific, wrung-out silence of a place where too much has happened, and everyone has retreated to process it separately. Lydia's door had been closed since 4 in the afternoon. I had not knocked. Upstairs, the sound of Donovan's television moved through the floor in a low, irregular murmur, the sound of a man using noise to avoid thinking. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of me and the light on over the stove. That one light. Margaret had always kept it on at night. Not the overhead, which she said made the kitchen feel like a waiting room, but the small one over the stove that threw a warm circle across the counter and let the rest of the room stay soft. I had kept that habit without deciding to. The envelope had been sitting in the desk drawer since Tuesday night, flap pressed down, but never sealed. I had brought it to the kitchen after dinner and read the list twice through, not because I had forgotten any of it, but because a watchmaker does not present evidence that has not been verified. There is no point in precision that you are not willing to stand behind completely. I heard his door open at 9:20. The stairs, the particular sequence of his footsteps heavier on the outside edge of each tread, the way he had walked since he was a teenager. I had always been able to tell which of my children was coming down the stairs by the sound alone. Margaret had found this remarkable. To me, it was just pattern recognition. Everything has a signature, if you pay attention long enough. Donovan came into the kitchen in a gray sweatshirt and socks, moving with the easy thoughtlessness of a man headed for the refrigerator. He pulled the door open, looked inside, reached for something on the second shelf. Then he registered me at the table. He straightened slowly. His eyes went to the envelope, then to me, then back to the envelope. "Sit down, Donovan." Not a command, just a statement of what was going to happen. There was a difference, and I had thought about which one I wanted. He hesitated one beat too, then pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. He did not take anything from the refrigerator. I slid the envelope across the table. He looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then he picked it up, unfolded the flap I had not sealed it, and drew out the single sheet of paper inside. I watched him read it. The list ran down the page in 2 columns. Dates on the left, amounts on the right, a brief description in the narrow space between them. 23 entries over 7 years. Some of the amounts were small, a few $100s, the kind of thing that might seem negligible in isolation. The pattern was not negligible. The earliest entry was March 2018. The most recent before the new ones was February of this year. He read slowly. I could tell when he reached the last section, because his posture changed. Something that had been held loosely in his shoulders went tighter. 2 new lines at the bottom of the list separated from the rest by a single blank space. October 2025, Ashford Tech Ventures Loan Guarantee. Forged signature $47,000. Supporting documentation attached. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had heard from my son before. Donovan had always been a person who filled silence with explanations, with deflections, with the easy, unearned confidence of someone who had spent 30 years understanding that volume could substitute for substance. This silence was different. This was the silence of a man looking at his own record and having nothing to say about it. He set the paper down on the table. "You've been keeping records," he said. "I keep everything I said, every invoice, every date, every number." I paused. "Your sister and I were not close when she was 18, but I still have the paperwork from the car I co-signed for her that year. I keep records the way I keep clocks running, not because I plan to use them, but because a thing worth doing is worth doing completely." He looked at the paper again. I could see him running through calculations behind his eyes, trying to find the angle, the approach, the version of this conversation in which he was not the person the document said he was. "I'm not asking you to pay it back," I said. "Any of it. That's not what this is." He looked up. "I want you to see what it cost," I said. "Not me, not just money. I want you to see it the way a person sees something when it's written down in front of them and they can't talk around it or wait for it to go away." I kept my voice even. "You should know what the record shows." Donovan's jaw moved slightly. The beginning of something, a justification maybe, or the particular kind of anger that surfaces when a person realizes they cannot reframe the situation in their favor. Whatever it was, he stopped it before it became words. He pushed back from the table and stood up. He was still holding the paper. "This isn't over," he said. I looked at my son. He was 32 years old, and he was standing in his childhood kitchen at 9:30 at night, holding a sheet of paper that described him with complete accuracy, and his face was the face of someone who has just understood that the ground they were standing on was never as solid as they believed. "Richard Holloway will call you at 9 tomorrow morning," I said. "I'd answer if I were you." The color left his face in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Not anger, not grief, something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The specific fear of a person who has spent years believing consequences were something that happened to other people, and who has just been informed clearly and without drama that they are not. He left the kitchen without another word. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavier now, slower. The sound of a man carrying something up to bed that he had not brought down with him. I sat for a while longer at the kitchen table. The stove light was still on. The envelope was still there, empty now. The paper gone with him. Outside the backyard was completely dark, and the workshop was a shape in the darkness, and the cedar sign was invisible from here. I turned off the stove light and went upstairs. The rain had started sometime before dawn, that particular October rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder or wind, just arrives in the night and settles in with the patience of something that intends to stay. By morning, it was a steady, indifferent drizzle against the kitchen window, the kind of rain that turns Portland streets dark and makes the maple in the backyard look like it's standing in a different season entirely. I had been at the kitchen table since 7:30, coffee. The newspaper I no longer read, but still kept subscribing to because Margaret had liked the physical weight of it in the morning. Outside the workshop was a gray shape through the rain-streaked glass. On the wall above the counter hung the kitchen clock, a Sessions mantle movement I had fitted into a simple walnut case 15 years ago when the original case had cracked beyond saving. I had regulated it twice since then. It had not lost or gained a minute in 4 years. I knew this because I checked it every morning, and because a clock that doesn't keep time is not a clock, it's a decoration, and I don't keep decorations. At 9 o'clock exactly, I heard Donovan's phone ring upstairs. I did not move. I sat with my coffee and listened. His voice came through the ceiling in fragments, the ordinary half-attention of a man answering a number he doesn't recognize. A brief exchange, a pause, then a longer silence that was not a pause at all. Then his voice again, but different, the difference between a man in conversation and a man receiving information he cannot interrupt. That went on for perhaps 4 minutes, then nothing. I heard his footsteps on the stairs before I heard his door. He came down fast, not running, but with the compressed urgency of someone whose body is moving ahead of his thinking. He came into the kitchen in yesterday's clothes, unshaved, and the color in his face was the color of the morning outside. He looked at me across the kitchen. "You got a lawyer involved?" he said. "I called my lawyer," I said. "There's a difference." He filed something. Donovan set his phone face down on the counter with a careful deliberateness that cost him something. He filed something with the county this morning. "My name is on—" He stopped, started again. "Dad," I panicked. The startup was failing, and I didn't know how to jump. "You used my name," I said. My voice came out the way the rain sounded through the window, steady, consistent, not raising itself to meet the weather. "You used my signature on a legal guarantee for $47,000, without asking me, without telling me, without anything. I set my cup down. And you let 4 people lose their money while they believed my name was backing the venture." Donovan's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment. "I was going to fix it," he said. "I know you believed that," I said. "I think you believe most things in the moment you say them." I looked at him. "That's not the same as fixing anything." A movement at the top of the stairs. I didn't look up, but I heard it, the particular quiet of someone who has come to the landing and stopped. Lydia. She had heard enough. I could not see her face from where I was sitting, but I heard the quality of her stillness change the stillness of someone whose understanding of a situation has just shifted in a way that cannot be shifted back. Donovan turned toward the stairs, then back to me, then toward the stairs again, the triangulated panic of a man who has lost the room in more than one direction at once. "So what happens now?" His voice had gone rough at the edges, in the way it does when volume is no longer available as a strategy. "You're going to let them go after me after everything?" "Richard filed an affidavit on my behalf," I said. "It establishes that the signature is not mine, and that I had no knowledge of the guarantee. My name is removed from those debts, Donovan. Your name is not." I let that settle for a moment. "That's all I've done. I've protected my own record. What happens to yours is a separate matter." He picked up the sheet of paper from the kitchen table, the list I had given him last night, which he had apparently brought back down without knowing why. He set it down again. His hands were not steady. I looked at his hands, then at mine. The tremor was there the way it always was. His hands were shaking for a different reason than mine. "Get a job, Donovan," I said quietly. "A real one. Before this becomes something you can't step back from." He stared at me. There was something in his face I hadn't seen there before. Not anger, which I was familiar with, and not the particular blankness of someone who has stopped listening. Something rawer. The expression of a man looking at a future that has just become concrete and unwelcome. He walked out of the kitchen, down the hall. The door to his room didn't slam it shut with the controlled, too careful closure of someone who knows that slamming it would be the one remaining thing that makes him look exactly as young as he is. I sat with my coffee in the rain-gray morning. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the stairs again, lighter this time measured. Lydia came into the kitchen, went to the coffee maker, poured herself a cup without saying anything. She pulled out the chair across from me, the same chair Donovan had not sat in long enough last night, and sat down. We did not speak for a while. The rain continued against the window, steady and without hurry. The clock above the counter read 9:17. Then Lydia wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face in a long time. Not the careful, assessing look she wore when she was calculating something, but something more tired and less defended. "Dad," she said. "Did you know about Donovan? Did you already know what he was doing before all of this started?" It was not the question I had been expecting. Not the question about the house or the sale or what she stood to lose. A question about her brother. About how much her father had seen and said nothing, and for how long. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. Outside, the rain moved through the maple in a slow, deliberate way, as if it were finding its way through the branches one at a time. Lydia's question was still sitting in the kitchen when I walked out the back door. She had asked it the way she asked most things that mattered, quietly, without drama. Both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, as if the warmth of it were something she needed to hold on to. I had told her I needed time to think. She had accepted that with a single nod and carried her cup back upstairs, and the house had settled into the particular stillness that follows a conversation that has been postponed rather than resolved. I left the breakfast dishes where they were and stepped out into the rain. The workshop door swung shut behind me. I turned the bench lamp on and stood still for a moment, letting the room come back to itself around me. Out here, the rain was a different thing entirely. Not the muted background presence it made inside the house, filtered through walls and insulation and ceiling, but something direct and immediate. The drops landing on the corrugated metal roof with a low, steady percussion that filled the space without overwhelming it. I had always thought more clearly under that sound than under silence. Silence left too much room for the wrong things to move in. I told myself I had come out to go through the tool cases. Practical work, the kind that keeps the hands occupied, while the mind finds its own way to wherever it needs to go. I started with the oldest case, the one that had come from my father's workshop the year he retired, 1987. A flat wooden box with brass fittings and a green felt lining that had long since faded to the color of old paper. I set it on the bench and lifted the lid. The top layer held things I had kept more out of habit than use a set of files worn past the point of precision. A mainspring winder from a manufacturer that had gone out of business sometime in the 90s. A loop with a hairline crack in the housing that I had been meaning to replace for at least 3 years. I set each piece aside. Beneath them, a folded layer of burgundy velvet covered the remaining contents. I lifted the velvet. In the far corner of the box, pressed flat against the wood, as if it had been placed there carefully and then left alone for a very long time, was a small notebook with a dark brown leather cover. I did not reach for it immediately. I stood at the bench with both hands resting on the edge and looked at it, the worn color of the leather lighter along the spine where it had been handled. The corners softened from years of sitting in the same position. I knew what it was before I fully understood that I was seeing it. The knowing came first, the way it does with things that belong to you, in a way that has nothing to do with ownership. I carried it to the corner of the workshop and sat down in the white ladder-back chair. Margaret's chair. I had not sat in it once in 6 years, had moved around it, worked around it, treated it the way you treat something that has become larger than its physical presence. Now I sat in it. The cushion held the same way it always had. The angle toward the window was exactly as she had always kept it. I opened the notebook. Her handwriting came up off the page the way her voice sometimes did, unexpectedly small and even blue ink. The careful cursive she had learned from her grandmother as a girl and never seen any reason to modernize. On the inside of the front cover, centered on the first page in letters slightly larger than the rest, for Walter. When the time comes. I turned to the first entry she had written directly to me. Walter, you fix things. That is who you are. It lives in your hands, in your eyes, in the way you are constitutionally unable to pass something broken without needing to understand what went wrong with it. But there is a category of broken that repairs make worse. Some mechanisms do not want to be corrected. They want to be set down and left in peace. The children are not clocks. You cannot regulate them the way you regulate a movement. You cannot identify the worn component, replace it with a better one, and expect the whole assembly to run true again. Some problems are not repair problems. Some problems are letting go problems. You have spent 40 years insisting there is no difference between those two things. There is a difference, love. There is. I sat with that for a while. The rain kept its steady rhythm on the roof. Through the small workshop window, the backyard was a single gray wash. The maple lost somewhere in the low light. The fence just a suggestion at the far edge. I turned several pages without choosing which ones, letting the notebook open where it wanted to. She had written about the garden in early spring, about sitting in this chair on Saturday mornings while I worked the particular quality of that sound she had described once as things being put right, about small observations she had wanted to keep somewhere outside her own memory. Then the passage about the children. They take because we give because we love them. But love and sacrifice are not the same word, Walter, and you have been using them interchangeably for so long that you have stopped noticing the substitution. My silence gave permission too. I am not placing this at your feet alone. I am telling you now only because I have run out of time to wait for a better moment. The last entry was near the back of the notebook. I could see from the handwriting that something had changed. By then still hers, still recognizably careful, but with less pressure behind it. Lighter, as if the effort of pressing ink into paper had become something to conserve. When your heart is more tired than your hands let go, Walter, just let go. The house is only a house. The workshop is only a room. You are not only a father. You are Walter James Ashford. You have always been more than the weight you chose to carry. I knew that the first morning I met you. I never once stopped knowing it. Don't forget. I closed the notebook. I had been bracing for something sharp, the accumulated force of 6 years of avoidance releasing all at once. What arrived instead was quieter and older than that. The specific sensation of setting down something heavy after carrying it long enough that the weight had become invisible, indistinguishable from your own body, and then feeling in its absence how much room there actually was. I remained in her chair while the light outside shifted from gray to a darker gray, and then to something close to dark. The rain held steady. Along the workshop walls, the clocks continued their overlapping conversation, each one marking the same moment in a slightly different register. The way witnesses to the same event always tell it differently. I had spent 40 years learning to hear that sound as a form of silence. Tonight, it held. After a while, I closed the notebook and slipped it into the inside pocket of my shirt, flat against my chest. I looked around the room one more time. The bench, the tools in their order. The bracket clock in the corner that had been here longer than either of my children. The cedar sign above the door, her handwriting burned into the wood patient and permanent exactly where she had placed it. I had stood in this room 1,000 times over 40 years. This time felt different. Not the way a thing feels when you are about to lose it. The way a thing feels when you have finally finished with it, when the work is complete, the mechanism set right, and all that remains is to wind it once more and let it run. My phone moved on the bench. Eleanor. Derek Sullivan called me directly. He's asking for a private meeting before he signs anything. His exact words, "Tell Mr. Ashford I only need 5 minutes. He'll understand why when he sees me." I looked out through the workshop window at the dark yard and the steady rain. The man in the gray canvas jacket. The photograph on the living room wall. Portland Technical College watchmaking program. Spring 2003. A young man at a bench on the first morning of the semester, hands resting quietly in his lap. Nothing on the surface in front of him, waiting without complaint, to be noticed. The memory returned the way memories do when they have been waiting, not all at once, but in sequence, each detail arriving and pulling the next one forward behind it. I remembered. After 3 days of rain, Portland had decided to be generous again. The light came in clear and particular, the way it only does after a long, wet stretch, sharper than usual. The air scrubbed clean every surface, catching it differently than it had the week before. I drove downtown with the window cracked and the heater on low, and let the morning come in at that angle the way Margaret used to insist on when the weather finally broke. Let it in, Walter. You've been inside your own head long enough. I had the notebook in my inside pocket. I had put it there when I got dressed that morning without thinking about it, the way you put on something that has become part of how you leave the house. Eleanor's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Southwest Morrison, a converted brick warehouse with tall windows and the kind of clean, spare interior that says a business takes itself seriously without needing to announce it. The receptionist showed me to a conference room at the end of the hall. Morning light came through the south-facing window in a wide band that fell across the table and made the room feel larger than it was. Richard Holloway was already there when I walked in. 11 years, and he looked the same as he always had. The tortoiseshell glasses, the dark suit that fit the way suits fit on men who have worn them long enough to stop noticing them. He stood when I entered and shook my hand with the brief, firm grip of someone who considers the handshake a professional instrument rather than a social gesture. He had a leather portfolio on the table in front of him and a legal pad covered in his small, precise handwriting. "Walter," he said, "just the name. Nothing added, nothing taken away." "Richard," I said. Eleanor was standing by the window. She gave me the small, composed nod I had come to recognize as her version of reassurance, the nod that said, "The room is under control, take your time." I sat down across from Richard. A moment later, the door opened again. The man who came in was somewhere in his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair cut close, and the kind of unhurried, self-contained way of moving that takes decades to develop. He wore a navy blazer over a collared shirt, no tie, the clothes of a man who has stopped trying to look like something and has simply become it. He was carrying a slim leather folder under one arm. He crossed the room and extended his hand. "Mr. Ashford." His voice was steady, a little lower than I remembered it being. "Derek Sullivan, Portland Technical College, 2003. I shook his hand and looked at his face. 22 years will change the topography of a person. The lines, the weight, the particular way age settles differently in different people, depending on what they've done with the time. But there was something in the way he stood that had not changed some quality of patient attention in his eyes. And when he sat down across from me, and the morning light caught his expression at a certain angle, I saw it. The smile. The particular contained smile of a young man who had sat at a workbench in the fall of 2003 with nothing on the surface in front of him, and had waited without asking to be noticed. I recognized the sign. he said. In the listing photos, Ashford and Company. I knew it immediately. He paused. I've been in Portland for 6 years. I drove past Eastmoreland twice. I never worked up the nerve to knock. You should have knocked, I said. Yes, he said. I know that now. We sat for a moment with that between us, not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that belongs to two people who have more history than conversation and are finding their way into it. Then Richard opened his portfolio. The sale documents were straightforward 7 pages, the kind of paperwork that represents the distillation of everything that matters about a transaction into language that leaves no room for misunderstanding. 472 days since I had first started thinking about this. 30 days to closing. 4 bedrooms, 2 stories, 200 square feet in Eastmoreland, Portland. Purchase price $580,000. I read through it carefully. I always read everything carefully. Richard had reviewed it twice and annotated the margins in his small handwriting, and there was nothing in it that surprised me or that I hadn't already decided to accept. I picked up the pen. My right hand had its usual slight tremor. The tremor that had been there for 3 years, that I had long since made peace with the way you make peace with any change in a mechanism you depend on. The signature came out clear. The W leaning into the A, the loop on the capital A, opening wider at the base the way it always had, the way it had always been mine and no one else's. Walter James Ashford. Richard took the pages. Then he set a second set of documents on the table. The conditional bequest, he said. As we discussed. I had drafted this with Richard 2 weeks ago on a Wednesday afternoon when the rain had started, and I had understood for the first time with real clarity that I was not just selling a house, I was deciding what came after it. 70% of the net proceeds from the sale to a charitable trust for the preservation and documentation of antique timepiece collections in the Pacific Northwest, an organization I had been quietly supporting for 11 years since the year after Margaret died. 30% to be held in a restricted account for Donovan and Lydia, available only upon independent verification by Richard Holloway, acting as trustee that each had maintained continuous, documented employment for a minimum of 2 years following the date of the sale. Not a punishment, not a reward, a condition, the kind that a careful man attaches to things he still believes in even when the believing is complicated. I signed it. Richard capped his pen and looked at me over his glasses with the expression he wore when he had done something he considered properly done. Everything is documented, Walter, he said. Every page, every condition, every party. He paused. Clean. The word landed in the room the way it had been landing in rooms for the past 10 days, with a weight that had nothing to do with how small it was. Eleanor exhaled quietly from her position by the window. I set the pen down. Derek had been sitting through the signing with his leather folder unopened on the table in front of him. Now he put one hand on it and looked at me directly. There's one more thing, he said. About the house itself. He stopped. I don't just want to buy it, Mr. Ashford. I want you to stay. I looked at him. What do you mean? I said. He opened the folder and placed a single document on the table between us. Face up, 3 paragraphs, a signature line at the bottom. I leaned forward and read the first line. Then I set it back down on the table. I turned to look at the window, the wide band of October light across the floor, the clean sky above the buildings, the particular clarity of a morning that has earned itself after several days of rain. Eleanor did not speak. Richard did not speak. I looked at the light for a long time. I got home at 3:15 to find the house exactly as I had left it. Lydia's door closed at the top of the stairs, Donovan's room quiet in the way it had been quiet all morning. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment in the ordinary stillness of a Friday afternoon, the kind that has nothing threatening in it, just the house settling into the later part of the day. My phone rang 4 minutes after I walked in. Lydia. Her voice was not the voice I had heard in the kitchen on Thursday morning, not the careful, controlled voice of a woman asking a question she had prepared herself to ask. This was something rawer. Dad. Donovan's at Providence Medical Center. Room 214. She stopped. I could hear her breathing, working to keep it even. Some people came to the house this afternoon. About money, about the startup. They had papers. They were aggressive about it. I know it wasn't legal the way they came, but Donovan panicked before anyone could say anything sensible. He tried to get out through the front door and he fell on the steps. His arm, they think it might be fractured. Dad, I didn't know what to do. Is he being treated? I said. Yes. They have him in a room. I'll go, I said. Go back inside and lock the front door. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after I hung up. Eleanor had said something to me that morning between the signing of the first document and the second, in the kind of aside that a professional offers when they have seen a situation play out before and want to make sure their client is not surprised by what comes next. Walter, once the legal filings are on record, the people Donovan owes money to will know the guarantee has been voided. Some of them are going to take that badly. Be prepared for things to move quickly from here. I had heard her. I had simply not expected quickly to mean the same afternoon. Providence Medical Center was 20 minutes from the house. I found a parking space on the second level of the garage and walked through the main entrance and down the east corridor to the elevator. The hospital had that particular quality of all hospitals, a carefully maintained neutrality, as if the building itself had decided that the most honest thing it could offer was an absence of opinion about whatever brought you there. Room 214 was at the end of a short hallway on the second floor. I knocked twice, pushed the door open. Donovan was sitting up in the hospital bed with his left arm in a temporary splint. They had not yet done the full imaging a nurse had told me at the desk, but the preliminary assessment was a hairline fracture of the radius, not a complete break. He was in a hospital gown, his color still off. His hair the way it looks when a person has been through something physical and has not yet had the time or the presence of mind to do anything about it. He looked at me when I came in, not the look he had given me across the kitchen table when I told him to watch me. Not the look from the bottom of the stairs when he heard the word realtor. This was something I had not seen on my son's face in a very long time. The face of a person who has run out of the specific kind of confidence that comes from believing the consequences are always something you can outmaneuver. He just looked scared. I pulled the chair from the corner and sat down beside the bed. Dad. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I think I'm in real trouble. Yes, I said. You are. He exhaled a long, unsteady breath. The guys who came to the house, they had papers. They said the guarantee was voided, and that meant the loan was callable immediately. And He stopped, looked down at his splinted arm. I panicked. I know, I said. A silence. In the hallway outside, a cart moved past with the soft, rubber-wheeled sound of hospital equipment. Someone spoke briefly at the nurse's station, the ordinary sounds of a building that absorbs crisis without commentary. Can you? Donovan began. No, I said. He looked at me. I signed the sale documents this morning, I said. Richard's filings are on record. Your name is on those debts, Donovan, not mine. That's where it needs to stay. I kept my voice the same way I had kept it in the kitchen on Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, not raised, not performed. Just level. The doctors here are good. Your arm is going to heal. The rest of it, the debts, the investors, whatever comes next, from the legal side, that's yours to work through. That's what being an adult means. You're leaving. It wasn't quite a question. I looked at my son in the hospital bed. 32 years old. I thought about the boy who had learned to ride a bicycle on the sidewalk in front of the house on a September morning in 1999, the year we bought the place. The way he had gotten back on every time he fell. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because I was watching, and he wanted me to see him not be afraid. That boy had been real. Whatever had happened between that morning and this one was real too, and it was his, not mine, to carry anymore. You're being taken care of, I said. You always have been. You just never noticed. I stood up. I looked at him once more, not with anger, not with grief, not with the particular weight of a father who has spent 30 years hoping a thing will turn out differently than it has, just clearly. The way you look at something when you have finally stopped trying to fix it. I walked to the door. Dad. I stopped with my hand on the frame but did not turn around. I waited. He didn't say anything else. I went out into the hallway and let the door close behind me gently, the way you close something that deserves to be closed with care, even when everything in you has already moved past it. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Fluorescent light, overhead linoleum underfoot, the neutral smell of a place designed for the process of recovery. I reached into my inside pocket and took out the notebook. I opened it to the last page. I read it once, standing there in the hallway outside room 214, Margaret's handwriting in the flat hospital light. When your heart is more tired than your hands let go, Walter. Just let go. I put the notebook back. On the way out, I passed a long window at the end of the second-floor corridor that looked west over the city, Portland. In the late afternoon, the light going gold over the rooftops. Mount Hood faint and snow-capped on the eastern horizon in the unusual clarity of a post-rain October sky. I thought about the document Derek had placed on the table that morning, the 3 paragraphs. The first line I had read before I put it back down and looked at the window. For the first time in longer than I could easily measure, I found that I wanted to go home. I slept 8 hours for the first time in 3 weeks. No particular reason, or maybe every reason, all of them adding up at once. I woke at 7 to the sound of the maple moving in a light wind outside the bedroom window, and the first thing I noticed was that the ceiling looked the same as it always had. And the second thing I noticed was that I was not dreading the day. That was new. I was downstairs making coffee when I heard Lydia's footsteps on the stairs, different from her usual morning pace, slower and more deliberate. The weight of luggage. I did not turn around when she came into the kitchen. I poured a second cup and set it on the table without asking. She set her bag down by the hallway door and stood for a moment looking at the cup. Then she sat. We didn't speak for a while. Outside the kitchen window, the street was wet from overnight rain. The fallen maple leaves plastered flat against the sidewalk in the particular way they go in mid-October, not blown, just settled, as if they had decided where they were going to be. 2 cups of coffee. A quiet house. Whatever this was, it deserved a minute. I knew about the startup, Lydia said. Her voice was different, not the careful, measured voice she had used in this kitchen for the past week and a half, the voice she wore when she was calculating something. This was underneath that, the voice of someone who has decided that the calculation isn't worth the cost anymore. Donovan told me 6 months ago, she said. I didn't say anything. I know, I said. She looked up. When you knew, I suspected, I said. There's a difference. A pause. Outside, a car moved slowly down the wet street. Why didn't you say anything to me, I mean? Why didn't you just... She stopped, started again, more honestly. Why didn't you call me out on it? I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table. She was 31 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, and she was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a teenager, something undefended. Because I was hoping I was wrong about you," I said. "I wanted to be wrong, Lydia." The kitchen was quiet for a long moment after that. Not uncomfortable, the silence of two people sitting with something true. She wrapped both hands around her cup the way she always did when she was thinking. Looked at the window. I did not rush it. After a while, she stood up, picked up her bag. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped facing the hallway, not looking back at me. "The watch," she said. "The one I tried to take. I'm sorry." 2 words. Nothing more. No explanation, no context, no architecture of justification built around them to make them easier to say. Just the 2 words standing on their own. I nodded once. She couldn't see it, but I think she knew. The front door opened and closed. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold, and the house entirely quiet around me. Not the heavy silence of the past 2 weeks, the silence of a place that has finished something and doesn't yet know what comes next. There is a kind of gear in a movement, a small one, that when it finally finds its correct position, allows everything around it to begin running at the right speed. You cannot force it. You can only create the conditions and wait and recognize the moment when it happens. I had not fixed either of my children. I had never been going to fix them. But one of them had just said, "I'm sorry," and meant it. And that was a gear beginning to turn. It was enough to work with. The side door knocked 2 short raps, the pattern I had been hearing for 20 years. Ray Kowalski stepped in, without waiting for an answer, the way he had been doing since the first winter we lived here. He was carrying a paper bag from the bakery on Milwaukee Avenue, and wearing his usual canvas coat with the collar up against the October air. He pulled out the chair across from me, set the bag on the table, and looked around the kitchen with the particular attention of a man who notices things but doesn't perform the noticing. "Both cars are gone," he said. "Both of them," I said. Ray nodded. One slow nod. Then he reached for the coffee pot, filled my cup before his own, and sat back in the chair without asking anything else. Outside, the October light was coming through the kitchen window in that clean, low-angle way it has after rain, landing on the table on the 2 cups on the paper bag from the bakery, on the empty chairs where my children had been sitting for the past 10 days. Ray tore off a piece of bread and set it in front of me without commentary. I picked it up. November had come in overnight, the way November does in Portland, not gradually, but as a fact. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees since the last week of October, and the morning had that particular gray-blue quality that means the season has changed and is not changing back. I drove downtown with the heater on and the radio off, and arrived at the notary's office on Southwest 3rd at 8:55. Richard was already inside. Eleanor arrived 2 minutes later, and Derek Sullivan came through the door at 9, exactly the same punctuality he had shown at the conference room 3 weeks ago. The quality of a man who considers being on time a form of respect. We shook hands. We sat down. The notary laid out the documents in order. The closing took 40 minutes. Transfer of title, final disbursement, release of all liens and encumbrances, 7 years of Richard's careful preparation distilled into a stack of paper that 2 people sign and a third certifies. I had read every page the night before, as I read everything before I sign it, and there was nothing in it that surprised me. 4 bedrooms, 2 stories, 200 square feet in Eastmoreland, Portland. Purchased 1999 for $178,000. Sold November 3rd, 2025 for $580,000. 26 years. I signed where Richard indicated. The notary stamped each page. Derek signed across from me, and when the last page was done, he looked up with the same contained, attentive expression he had worn at the workbench in 2003. "One more document," he said. He opened his leather folder and placed it on the table between us. 3 paragraphs, a signature line at the bottom. The same document I had seen in this form 3 weeks ago, and had not been ready to read completely. Today, I read all of it. Lifetime lease agreement. Lessee Walter James Ashford. Annual rent $1.00 payable on January 1st of each calendar year. The third paragraph was the one I had not read before. I read it now, slowly. Neither Donovan Ashford nor Lydia Ashford shall enter the property at 1847 Southeast Eastmoreland Avenue without prior written consent of the lessee. Violation of this condition shall constitute grounds for immediate termination of tenancy at the lessor's sole discretion. I set the document down. Looked at Derek. "You didn't have to do this," I said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't have to." He leaned forward slightly, both hands on the table, and spoke with the directness of someone who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and has decided to say it without decoration. "You handed me a set of tools when I had nothing in front of me, and you didn't make anything of it. You didn't ask for gratitude. You didn't keep track." He paused. "I'm offering you a roof when you need one. That's all this is, Mr. Ashford. An even exchange between two people who understand the value of things." I looked at the document for a moment longer. Then I picked up the pen. My right hand had its usual tremor, the one that had been there 3 years and that I had stopped apologizing for. The signature came out the way it always came out. Walter James Ashford. The W into the A, the loop on the capital opening wider at the base. Mine. No one else's. Richard witnessed it. The notary stamped it. Eleanor added it to the file with the precise efficiency of a woman who has closed hundreds of transactions and understands that the paperwork is not the moment is something else, something that happens in the room while the paperwork is being handled. Richard stood and extended his hand. "Everything is clean, Walter," he said. "Exactly as you wanted it." The fourth time I had heard that word in a month. I did not say so. I shook his hand and thanked him, and it was sufficient. Outside, the November air was cold and particular, the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from somewhere nearby. And underneath that, the city smell of coffee and pavement that Portland has carried as long as I have lived here. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the notary's office and let it come in. 68 years old. $580,000 in an account bearing my name. A workshop and 4 bedrooms to return to whenever I chose at the annual price of a single dollar bill. No one in the rooms I didn't invite. Nothing unpaid, nothing unresolved, nothing outstanding. For a long moment I stood there on the sidewalk and did not go anywhere at all. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I looked at the screen and read the message. "Dad, I got a job. First day was last Monday. Small accounting firm downtown. I'm trying. Lydia." I read it once, then again. She did not know about the 2-year condition Richard had written into the bequest. She was not writing to satisfy a legal requirement. She was just writing in the uncertain way of someone who does not know if the door is still open, but has decided to knock anyway. I put the phone in my coat pocket. I did not reply, but I did not delete it either. I walked north on 3rd into the November morning, into the city I had lived in for 40 years, into whatever came next. The morning came in cold and clear, the kind that follows several days of rain and makes the city look like it has been washed back to something essential. I had been up since 6. 6 boxes in the front hallway. Everything a life of 40 years in this house had condensed into once you removed what belonged to the house and not to you. I walked through the rooms one last time. The kitchen, the oak table, 25 years of breakfasts, the ring marks from 10,000 coffee cups, Margaret's chair on the left, the one she always took because she liked to look out at the yard while she ate. I pulled it out slightly before I left, the way she always left it, not pushed all the way in. The living room. the wall above the sofa where the photographs had been, faint, bright squares in the paint, where the frames had protected it from years of light, the ghost shapes of 20-something pictures in the arrangement Margaret had spent a Saturday morning, getting exactly right. The reading room, the shelves empty now, the wood lighter where the books had stood and darker at the edges where nothing had rested. The small indentation on the third shelf where the brown leather notebook had pressed for 20 years. I had the notebook in my inside pocket, where it had been since October. Then the workshop. I stood in the doorway and let the room be what it was. The bench, the pegboard, the clock faces on the wall, all still running. The bracket clock in the corner that had been here longer than my children. On the bench, the 1943 Hamilton pocket watch sat in its open cedar box. I had finished it Thursday evening, the movement clean, the escapement running true, nothing compensating for anything else. The last repair completed in this room. I looked at the sign above the door. Ashford and Company, Timepiece Restoration. Margaret's lettering practiced 3 times on cardboard before she touched the cedar. Paint worn to bare wood at the corners where her hands had been. I had thought about taking it. I had decided against it. It belonged here. Whatever this room became, it would have that name above the door, and the name would mean something to Derek in a way it could not mean anywhere else. That was enough. I closed the cedar box, carried it to the front door. Ray was at the fence, canvas coat collar up, hands in his pockets, breath making small clouds in the cold air. He had been there a while, I suspected. "You all set, Walt?" "All set," I said. He looked at the house, then at me. 20 years of Saturday mornings and coffee and the easy silence of 2 people who knew when not to talk, and it came down to 2 nods on a cold November morning, which was exactly the right amount. I loaded the last box, set the cedar case on the passenger seat, sat down behind the wheel. Before I turned the key, I looked at the house through the windshield. Brown roof, front porch with its 2 steps, the maple at the corner of the yard, bare now branches, clean and dark against the pale sky. The narrow path to the workshop, the small window, and just above it, the sign. I started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the house shrank the way things do when you move away from them, steadily, not disappearing, just growing smaller in proportion to the distance. The maple, the porch, the roof line. I held it in the mirror until I reached Knapp Street, turned south, and the Douglas firs along the curb moved across the glass, and the house was gone. I did not look away before it was. 25 years deserved to be seen all the way to the end. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on the east bank of the Willamette. Small 1-bedroom, a kitchen window that looked out over the river. 12 minutes from Eastmoreland. I had signed the lease in October. I set the cedar box on the new workbench and lifted out the pocket watch. The ticking filled the room immediately, 1 clock in a quiet space, present and steady and doing exactly what it was made to do. I placed the brown leather notebook beside it. Then I went to the kitchen and put the coffee on. Outside, the Willamette moved through the late November afternoon the way it always does, patient, unhurried, indifferent to the season. From the window, I could see the near bank, the bare cottonwoods, the downtown skyline going gray in the fading light. The coffee finished. I poured a cup and stood at the window. No one needed anything from Walter Ashford tonight. After 68 years, the house, the marriage, the children, the 40 years of careful work, the October that had rearranged everything, what remained was this: a cup of coffee, a river outside the window, a clock ticking in the next room. It was enough. More than enough. It felt the way only true things feel, like the first morning of something. I am not a man who speaks about faith often, but I believe this God does not take things from you without reason. Sometimes He clears the weight from your hands, so you are finally free to hold something worth keeping. That is what this grandpa stories taught me, not in a church, but in a workshop in October at 68 years old. This family story is mine. And I am not proud of all of it. I stayed silent for too long. I paid debts that were not mine to pay. I called it love, when a large part of it was just fear of the empty chair, fear of the argument, fear of becoming a father who let go. If this family story sounds like yours, I am asking you directly. Don't wait for October the way I did. Don't be like me and spend 6 years telling yourself the time hasn't come. Don't let the silence become permission the way I let it. Don't be like me and call it patience when it is really just avoidance. Don't confuse love with disappearing one quiet payment at a time. Don't be like me and forget that protecting someone and carrying them are not the same thing. That is my opinion. I have earned it the hard way. What I know now after the house, the signature, the envelope, the notebook, and $1 a year is that the people who truly love you will still be standing at the fence when you finally draw the line. The ones who leave when you do were never really staying. These grandpa stories exist, so someone younger than me can hear that before it costs them as much as it cost me. If a moment in this grandpa story stayed with you, leave it in the comments below. I read every single one. If you know someone carrying too much and calling it love, share this family story quietly. That small act might be enough. And if you are not subscribed, yet stay. There is more to come, and I believe you will want to be here for it. Thank you for watching until the very end. It means more than I can say. One last note, the stories ahead include fictional elements shaped with care for the purpose of storytelling. If that is not what you came for, no hard feelings at all. Choose the content that serves you. But if you are staying, I am genuinely glad you are here.